Erev Tov, everybody. We are in Parashat Beha'alotcha, our third essay of Rav Elchanan Samet, continuing along using the English translations, which match our time needs a little bit better. But the Hebrew, which hopefully you have on email, those links are a little more expanded. So there's you can go beyond what we've covered here there if you want. And this essay we're going to look at feels like a very characteristic of Rav Samet's approach, a kind of close analysis based on breaking down a story into sections using some themes like keywords to try to do a literary analysis, which winds up with kind of a homiletical message to some degree, but also exposes us to questions we're not even always necessarily obviously asking, unless we have the kind of literary analytical approach that he really champions. So I think oftentimes the questions in Nechama or the questions in Rav Meidan often are more obvious questions. These are kind of more literary questions in a sense. And so it really sharpens our eye to those. So let me share my screen. We'll get started. Okay. This is called Moshe versus the Lustful, Leadership in Crisis, and starts off two themes in the story of Kivrot HaTa'ava. The recounting of the events that took place at Kivrot HaTa'ava stretches over 32 psukim in chapter 11, from pasuk 4 until the end of the chapter at pasuk 35. The most obvious difficulty arising from even a cursory review of the narrative is that it includes two different themes, which are intertwined throughout. Now, he calls this the obvious difficulty that arises from a cursory review of the narrative. I don't think I ever asked this obvious question, even though I've certainly reviewed the narrative cursorily many times. But I think it does give us a chance to sort of put something much more concrete on maybe at least a sense we have. So we're just going to quickly skim the chapter. And again, we may come up with the question now prompted, or we may not. But he'll then break it down for us and it'll become much more clear. So chapter 11 begins with the people complaining in front of Hashem, and God gets angry and a fire breaks out, and people cry out to Moshe, and he responds and the fire dies down. The place is called Tav'era because a fire of God, but Tav'era meaning burning fire of God had broken out amongst them. That's kind of a pre-story, which Rav Samet will analyze to put this in greater context a little bit later. That's the opening little narrative. We're sort of putting that on the side now. Pasuk 4 starts. The riffraff in their midst had a gluttonous craving, and the Israelites wept and said, if only we had meat to eat, and we remember all the food we ate in Egypt. Now we have no food to eat. We got a description of the man and how the people used to gather it. Moshe heard the people weeping. Hashem was angry, and Moshe said to Hashem, why have you dealt ill with your servant? Did I produce these people? Did I, that you are kind of charging me with the responsibility that you have charged me for them? Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? I can't carry them by myself. I'd rather off die. Hashem says, okay, gather these 70 elders and, I'll share your spirit upon them, and you won't bear the responsibility of the people alone. And then tell the people, purify yourselves. Tomorrow you're going to eat meat. But that meat is not going to last a short time. You're going to eat it for a whole month till it comes out of your nostrils and becomes terrible because you rejected God. And then Moshe says, the people who are with me are 600,000, God, yet you say you're going to give them enough food to eat for a month. How could this even really be possible? And Hashem says, is there a limit to my power? And Moshe goes out and reports the words of Hashem to the people and gathers the 70 elders. And then Hashem draws from Moshe's spirit and spreads it on the elders. We have the story of Eldad and Medad, who were not with that group, but they continued to prophesy, and Moshe gets told about it, and he says, if only all of God's people were prophets. He comes back into the camp, and the wind from God starts, and spreads the quail, and the people gather up all the quail, and they're still eating it when the plague of God comes forth, a very harsh plague, and the place is called Beha'alotcha ta'ava, because the people who had the craving, ta'ava, were buried there, kever, were buried there, and the people set out from Beha'alotcha ta'ava to Chatzerot. Okay, so, it feels like it's hard now, having read Rav Samet's framing, not to start to notice these sort of two intertwined stories, but it feels like people are complaining. Moshe is upset and turns to God and says, how am I supposed to deal with this? And God answers, you get leaders, get additional leaders. Here's how I'm going to respond to the people. It doesn't feel like two completely separate narratives, but maybe two things happening that are interwoven. And again, if I were reading it without that frame, I wouldn't even necessarily ask the question. But for Rav Samet, it's clear that there are two separate stories here, and he's going to flesh this out and why he thinks that they're separate, and then what to make of the intertwining of them. He writes, the first subject is the complaint of those who desired meat and the other delicacies of Egypt. The discussion between Hashem and Moshe concerning the satisfaction of their desire, right? That's Moshe saying, does God really have enough to feed them for a whole month? And the arrival of the quail, bringing the punishment of the sinners. This subject is dealt with in 18 psukim of the story. The second subject involves Moshe's complaint as to his inability to lead the nation on his own. Hashem's answer and Hashem's instructions in this regard, right? Gather the 70 elders, and their realization by Moshe. Moshe actually goes ahead and does it in the story of Eldad and Medad. This subject occupies 14 psukim of the story. The alternation between these two subjects throughout the story divides it into 6 sections. Verses 4 to 10, complaint of the lustful. Right? Remember we said it started in verse 4 after that little quick story about people complaining and there being a burning fire. That was the first 3 verses of the chapter. So verse 4 starts the complaint of the people. We wish we had what to eat like we had in Egypt, and description of the man. Then we have Moshe's complaint, Moshe turning to God, saying, God, why did you, assign me to lead these people? How am I supposed to deal with everything they're asking? Then God's response to Moshe about the 70 elders, gather the 70 elders, and I'm going to, spread your spirit onto them. Then Hashem's response to the nation, and go tell the nation that they're not going to get just meat for one day, but they're going to get it for 30 days, and it's going to be, terrible for them. Then the appointment of the 70 elders, and then the appearance of the quail. The connection between the two subjects contained in the story is to be found in section B. The crying of the nation to Moshe with their demand for meat is the apparent cause of Moshe's complaint to God, right? This is one of the reasons why it doesn't really feel like two separate stories, because they're very much connected in this sort of first phase, when Moshe turns to God and says, from where do I have meat to give this whole nation? For they cry to me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. For Rav Samet, this is part of Moshe's complaint about having to lead alone, but in it, he references the people's complaint about food, which is section A. From this point onwards, Moshe's complaint and that of the nation are treated separately. In Hashem's response to Moshe, we see a clear separation of the two issues, and therefore the response is divided into 2 units, C and D. Hashem's response to Moshe about the 70 elders, and Hashem's response to the nation about the meat and the plague. And again, in the description of the realization of the solutions, E and F, the whole story with the 70 elders, and the whole story with the appearance of the quail, the Slav, we detect no connection between them. Okay, so we have that moment of intersection, but then they really seem to branch off to be juxtaposed, but separate units. We therefore have 2 apparently separate stories, from which from a common starting point, develop independently. Why then are they intertwined in the narrative? Now, Rav Samet is briefly going to entertain some answers and say why he doesn't think they're good enough answers. The common time frame, right, they're actually happening as part of kind of this same period of time, is an unsatisfactory explanation. Why, we must ask, was it specifically this complaint of the nation that drove Moshe to burst out with his complaint? And secondly, why is the addressing of Moshe's complaint bound up with the addressing of the nation's complaint on the factual, real level? Even if they're interconnected at the beginning, then somehow they should still be told as 2 separate stories. The complaint of the nation could first have been dealt with, and only then attention paid to Moshe's complaint. While what in fact occurs is the opposite, right? Moshe's complaint gets dealt with, Hashem's response to Moshe, and then response to the nation, then the carrying out of what Hashem tells Moshe is going to happen in terms of the leadership, and then the carrying out of the response to the nation. Thirdly, even if this alternation reflects what really took place, and now this is where we get, I think, to a key Rav Samit principle, the literary description is not bound to follow the chronological reality. The Torah doesn't need to narrate things in the precise order they happened. We might think that that's the default, but for Rav Samit, that's not even obviously the default because of the following reason he explains. A biblical story holds a special message, molded in its specific literary nature, in its structure and style and all its means of expression. This is great because we get a kind of programmatic comment from him here. The story is not an exact mechanical replica of reality, but rather a selective artistic representation of parts of reality in such a way as to lend them special significance. We can certainly think about this idea. We think about some of the big questions, why are particular narratives in the life of the patriarchs and matriarchs mentioned and not others? Why, how do we understand the creation story relative to the scientific or historical account, right? Because those things are stories, and stories are not an exact mechanical replica of reality, but a selective artistic representation of parts of reality in such a way as to lend them special significance. Therefore, the mixture of two different stories within the same joint framework presents a literary problem. This is already now a very kind of strong articulation, since it may harm both of them, right? Something is lost if we wanted to tell the story of Moshe's challenge over leadership, or the story of the people's complaining over not having enough food, and then the response with the plague and the meat, right? Those stories should have their own integrity, and interrupting with another story could harm both of them, even though it achieves the goal of maybe narrating things in the order that they actually happen. But whatever the story is supposed to achieve will be impacted. Okay, it's a little bit of called klutz kasha, kind of a question that really just leads or begs the answer, but he's going to now share that to us. Unity of the story based on structure and guiding word. In a very simple manner, we may join each adjacent pair of units under a single brief heading, which serves as their common denominator. So units A and B are the complaints, right? The people's complaint and Moshe's complaint. Units C and D are Hashem's responses to each. Units E and F are the solutions put into effect. This structure already hints at the connection between the two subjects dealt with in the story. One of the outstanding stylistic techniques of biblical narrative is the use of a guiding word. In Hebrew, milah mancha, in German, I think, Leitwort. It is repeated throughout the story, or in some of its parts, in such a way as to draw our attention. It usually appears 7 times, right? That leading word or guiding word usually appears 7 times, or some multiple of 7. Sometimes it's found several times within a small number of psukim. Other times it is spread throughout the entire story, but at strategic moments. Sometimes the guiding word changes its meaning and its context, therefore hinting at change in the course of the story. Meaning, if you discover the guiding word and then follow how it appears through a story, the way it shifts may reflect some kind of progress or change in the story. At times, the guiding word serves as a stylistic cordon, unifying all the different parts of the story. Of course, there are many more possibilities. Is there a guiding word in our story that serves as a stylistic cordon connecting its 2 subjects and 3 sections? The root aleph, samech, fei, asaf, fulfills this function. He's going to take us through its appearances. Verse 4, and the multitude, the asaf suf, that was in their midst began to lust. This is the nation's complaint. Then, verse 16, Hashem said to Moshe, gather to me, asfali, maybe esfali, can't remember, 70 men of the elders of Israel. That's already Hashem's response to Moshe's complaint. Then shall all the fish of the sea be gathered, safe for them to suffice them. Moshe's response to God's addressing the Bnei Israel. Vayesof, and he gathered 70 men of the elders of Israel. That's Moshe carrying out a solution to the leadership question. And Moshe returned, was gathered by Asaph into the camp, he and the elders of Israel. I think that's the end of that section. The resolution of the leadership challenge. And they gathered Vayasfu, the quails. And then finally, in that same pasuk, the least of them, Asaph, gathered 10 chomarim, which takes us to 7 appearances of the word. 4 appearances of the guiding word, numbers 1, 3, 6, and 7, belong to the complaint of the lustful and its solution, while the other 3 belong to the problem of Moshe's leadership. So this already kind of points in the direction of the stylistic cordon, which connects the 2 subjects and the 3 sections. We have this word which interweaves between both of them and sort of shows us that there's a coherent whole here. Attention should be paid to the fact that each of the 3 parts of the story opens with the guiding word. You can go back and check that against his section breakdown on your own. We have therefore located a stylistic element that unifies the story as a whole, right? This element, this keyword of Asaph, gathering. But here the following key question arises. What is the internal connection between the Asaph Suf, the multitude, right? That was the group group that complained, and the Asepha, the gathering of the 70 elders, which was the solution to the leadership problem. So the complainers about food and the solution group to the leadership problem are the same root, meaning something different. And how is the gathering, Hayasfut, of Moshe and the elders of Israel into the camp related to the gathering, Isuf, of the quails that are lying about all over the camp? There are other guiding words in the story, and they too serve as a unifying factor, but this word will suffice us for the purposes of a systematic analysis. So that's kind of Rav Samet leaving on the side for us. There's more here. We're going to focus in on our number 1 keyword. The gravity of the complaint of the lustful, circumstances and timing. Okay, so the gravity of the crying of the lustful becomes apparent, right? Why this is such a big deal, the hungry people complaining about missing what they had in Egypt and about food. The gravity of the crying of the lustful becomes apparent when compared with a parallel event described in Shemot 16, back in Parashat Beshalach. And the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin on the 15th day of the 2nd month after the exodus from Egypt. Okay, so a month after Yetziat Mitzrayim. And all the children of Israel complained to Moshe and to Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, if only we had died by Hashem's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. You have brought us out to this wilderness to kill this whole congregation with hunger. The complaint seems reminiscent of the complaint in our narrative, which we have, who will feed us meat? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for nothing. Now our soul is dried up, there is nothing. Similar themes. But there, in fact, are 2 fundamental differences between these 2 stories. First is the timing. The story in Shemot takes place just after the Exodus, just 1 month after the nation leaves Egypt. The nation is as yet unused to the new life of freedom, and every difficulty gives rise to complaint. The story in Bamidbar, in contrast, takes place from the timestamp we have in the previous chapter 10, verse 11, in the 2nd year, in the 2nd month. That is more than a year after the Exodus, close to a year after the revelation at Sinai, and a short time after the establishment of the Mishkan. After all these preparatory events, one might have expected the nation to have reached a higher level. They developed their relationship with God. They have experienced all these covenantal moments. They're still complaining a year later. The circumstances. The complaint of the nation in Sefer Shemot reflects a certain measure of objective justification, meaning we really understand why they were complaining then. The complaint was raised before the manna started falling, and the nation was truly afraid of dying of hunger in the wilderness. It was only in the wake of their complaint that the manna began to fall every morning, and in the evening the quails descended and covered the camp. The complaint in Sefer Bamidbar, on the other hand, arises not from a shortage of food and a fear of starvation, but rather from a lust for meat. The manna had continued to fall regularly for the entire year since the time of the event described in Sefer Shemot. Corresponding to the complaint of the nation concerning the man, back in Shemot, that our soul is dried up, there is nothing except for this manna before our eyes. The Torah, this is here, corresponding to the complaint of the nation concerning the man, right, that our soul is dried up, for there is nothing but the man. The Torah describes over the course of 3 psukim, again, this is in our chapter, the advantages of the man. Its taste like the taste of oil cake, the way it fell when the dew fell upon the camp, its pleasing appearance, and its range of possibilities for the preparation. Thus, it is not the man that is dried up, but rather the soul of the nation, as they declare, right? So on purpose, the Torah, when Bnei Israel complain in Shemot about not having anything to eat, there's no kind of narrator response. Oh yeah, but they had this and this. Here, when they're complaining about, not having enough to eat, or we only have the man, the narrator is telling us, but the man was fine. It was good. They had enough. So this complaint is not about hunger. It's just about lust for more. There are two grave aspects to the crying of the nation. Firstly, this is an expression of ingratitude towards Hashem's mercies to them in the desert, with false slander of the wonderful miracle of the man that kept them alive from day to day. Secondly, their words reflect a longing for the life of degrading slavery in Egypt and their preference for this life over the life of freedom, which did admittedly involve spiritual tension and enduring of the journeying through the desert, but not hunger and deprivation. So like a year later, we can now say they are being fed, and yet they're still complaining. And they have a whole spiritual infrastructure of their life with God, even though it's not easy, not like where they were at just after coming out of Egypt, and yet they're still complaining. Therefore, this is not a normal complaint with some objective factual basis that may be addressed in order to solve it. The complaint here is nothing more than a pure expression of the lowly spirit of the nation. And this is not necessarily Rav Samet criticizing as much as just really trying to describe. This is coming from the people not being in a good place. It represents a profound spiritual regression. Okay, maybe that's a criticism from all the events of the past year, from the Exodus and all its miracles, from the revelation at Sinai, from the Mishkan. And no less importantly, it represents an abandonment of the vision of the future to which their journey in the desert is directed, the entry into the promised land. The complaint of the lustful for meat prolongs and intensifies the previous sin described in the 3 psukim that open our chapter. Now he's going to link to there, which serve as a sort of introduction to our story. The nation was like complainers. It was evil in Hashem's ears. Hashem heard and Hashem's anger burned. Here too, there is no objective basis to their complaint, other than the fact that the journey to the land of Canaan has recommenced after a prolonged stay at Har Sinai. Really, well, we'll let him explain. That's what it's coming right on the heels of. So we'll see that in a moment. These two complaints, that of the complainers, i.e. the first 3 verses of our chapter, and that of the lustful, the bulk of the remainder of the chapter, arise at the start of Bnei Israel's joyful journey towards the land of their destiny. Prolonged preparations have been made during their long stay at for the moment of their departure. Now the moment of future chapter. Second year lifted from above the Mishkan of the testimony. And Bnei Israel took up their journey from the wilderness of Sinai, and then describes how they marched according to their encampments, etc. And then at the end of the chapter, and the ark of Hashem's covenant traveled before them, and the cloud of Hashem was upon them by day as they traveled. And here, that's pretty much takes us to the end of chapter 10. And here, just as the action begins, the nation is responsible for a terrible anticlimax, causing Hashem frustration and anger. And Hashem heard, and Hashem's anger burned. And Moshe heard the nation crying by its families, each man at the entrance to its tent, and Hashem's anger burned greatly. Okay, so we now have the setting. We understand the gravity of the complaints, the kind of moment at which they're coming, which is supposed to be a moment of so much promise and possibility, and the fact that the complaints don't seem to have a strong, compelling basis, objective basis, as Rav Samet calls it, and that sort of makes this all the more difficult and painful. This, by the way, is sort of situated in the context of a set of teachings, I think, from the kind of Gush world, Yeshivat HaKibbutz Hadati world. Rav Menachem Leibtag developed these, and others, kind of breaking Bamidbar into 2 halves, with this sort of key thing that happens in Beha'alotcha of those 2 little verses, separated off by those inverted nuns, which the sages say they kind of represent a book unto itself. And that leads people to sort of suggest you have, the first 10 chapters of Bamidbar up until that point, and then the subsequent, following chapters, the rest of the book on the other side of that, and they sort of describe it as kind of the ideal versus the real, right? The Bamidbar and Naso as the arrangement of the camp and the census and the structure and the flags, and the way that the cloud was going to journey with them and the way they were going to, collapse and take the tabernacle with them. This is sort of the idealized structure of the journey. And then when they actually take off, real life sets in, and the rubber meets the road and they start to complain. And again, not a criticism of the people as much as just a recognition that, we set up a vision of how we want things to be, and then life gets in the way. Okay, so next section, from the loftiest heights to the lowliest pits. What is the significance of this event? Now, remember, we're going to make our way back. We've been building towards our question, which is, why is this story of the complaining interspersed with this, complaint of Moshe about leadership and this story about leadership? What is the significance of this event from the subjective perspective of Moshe, the leader of the nation? The event described at the end of chapter 10, prior to moving away from Har Sinai, opens a window to his soul. We find there a dialogue between Moshe and his father-in-law, in which Moshe invites Yitro to accompany the nation of Israel to the place concerning which Hashem said, I shall give it to you. In this dialogue, Moshe is depicted as full of enthusiasm and limitless optimistic aspirations with regard to the future. How does Moshe describe to Yitro what's ahead? Says, we are traveling to the place concerning which Hashem said, I shall give it to you. Come with us, Moshe says to Yitro, and we shall be good to you, v'heitavnu lach, for Hashem has spoken good of Israel. And then a few psukim later, it shall be, if you come with us, then that good that Hashem will do for us, the same good we shall do for you. The word good, tov, is repeated a total of 5 times in these 2 utterances of Moshe, as an object and as a verb. There is a sense of divine good that is about to overflow towards Israel, to the extent that it can also even include others. This good is obviously related to the entry into the good land, Haaretz HaTovah, right? So Moshe is filled with optimism. He feels God's goodness is going to be showered upon the people. It can extend out to Yitro. There's an overflow of good. That's kind of the last little bit of chapter 10. Let us now turn our attention to the anticlimax of chapter 11. Verse 1. That's again our little pre-story. And the nation were like complainers, ra be'inei Hashem, be'oznei Hashem. It was evil in God's ears, and God heard, and God's anger burned. And then in verse 10, after the nation's complaint, Moshe heard the nation complaining by their families. The anger of Hashem burned greatly, and it was evil in Moshe's eyes, ra. And Moshe said to Hashem, why have you done evil with your servant, lama harayota la'avdecha, to place the burden of this entire nation upon me? If you deal thus with me, please kill me, Moshe said to God. Let me not see my suffering, literally my evil. And to the nation you shall say, God says to Moshe in resolving I think this must be resolving their complaint over over not having meat. Yeah. No, this is the beginning of Hashem's response to Moshe over the leadership. Verse 18. And to the nation you shall say, for you have cried in Hashem's ears, saying, etc., it was good for us in Egypt. Tov lanu b'Mitzrayim. Corresponding to the 5 expressions of good prior to their departure, chapter 11, which describes the initial journeys in the desert, describes their opposite. Not Hashem has spoken good of Israel, but rather the nations were like complainers, evil in Hashem's ears. This contrast already indicates the degree of their failure. But at this point, it has not yet affected Moshe. When he hears the crying of the nation lustful for meat, he suddenly perceives the abyss before him, the impossible distance between the aspirations for the future and the appreciation of the greatness of the hour that beat within him, and the childishness of the nation crying for meat and longing for its degrading past, for it was good for us in Egypt, and it was evil in Moshe's eyes. So we have this contrast between the vision of good and then the way the people actually behave, which is perceived as evil. The psychological crisis facing the nation's leader is now unavoidable. From the loftiest heights, Moshe has fallen to the lowest depths of despair. What formerly appeared as a movement toward the limitless good that Hashem would bestow upon Israel becomes now, in Moshe's monologue, the evil that Hashem has done to him by placing upon him the burden of leading this whole nation to the land you promised to their forefathers. And he concludes with a request that indicates his wish to be released from his task. Let me not see my misfortune, ra'ati. As elevated as Moshe's spirit was at the time of his great hopes, so deep now is his despair. This is a natural reaction in face of such great disappointment in the nation. And Moshe's psychological state finds expression in his speech. James asked earlier about the language of joyful journey. Yeah, I don't know that was just flowery language. We can try to catch what it was in the Hebrew if we have time at the end. Okay. Now, Moshe's monologue of complaint. An analysis of Moshe's speech where the two themes are explicitly connected reveals its sophisticated literary structure and internal unity. As we shall see below, Pasuk 13, from where do I have meat, is not an intertwining of Bnei Israel's complaint with his own personal one. Rather, it is a vital ingredient without which the speech loses its main point. A biblical monologue is generally a sophisticated literary unit which should be given special attention in its analysis. Okay, file that away. When you see a biblical monologue, you have to give a close literary look to it. Moshe's speech, right? Because typically the Torah will just have, in narrative, speeches are usually very short, back and forth conversations. So when one character speaks for a while, think about Yehuda's impassioned plea to Yosef, to free, to free Binyamin. All these types of things. These are, important literary structures or units on their own. Moshe's speech is composed of two halves with an almost equal number of words, with a chiastic structure of correspondence. Let us firstly examine this correspondence. Okay, so we got that Moshe speech, two halves, almost equal number of words. This is, by the way, a classic characteristic of Tehillim. A lot of those who do literary analysis of Tehillim generally feel that a parak of Tehillim divides into roughly two equivalent halves. And here also with a chiastic structure of correspondence. Let's first examine this correspondence. Rav Samet, by the way, wrote a particularly, analysis of a number of chapters of Tehillim. He has a book on that. Why have you done evil to your servant? And why have I not found favor in your eyes, that you place the burden of this whole nation upon me? Did I conceive this whole nation? Did I give birth to it? That you have said to me, carry them in your bosom like a nurse carries a baby to the land that you promised to their forefathers. That's the first half. Favor in your eyes, burden of this whole nation, and this whole nation. From where do I have meat to give to this whole nation that is crying to me, saying, give us meat that we may eat? I am unable alone to bear this whole nation, for it is too heavy for me. If you deal with me thus, please kill me, if I have found favor in your eyes, and let me not see my misfortune. Okay, so you see from what he's capitalized, done evil, not found favor in your eyes, burden of the nation, whole nation, and then on the way out, whole nation, bearing the whole nation, if I have found favor in your eyes, and again, evil or misfortune. The first half comprises two rhetorical questions, each of which is double. Why and why? Did I? Did I? Each of these dual questions negates the existing situation in which Moshe is the leader of Israel. The first question negates the perception that Hashem selected Moshe for leadership because Hashem wished to bestow good upon him and because Moshe found favor in his eyes. The opposite is true. From Moshe's perspective, the giving of leadership is an evil that Hashem is doing towards him, and an expression of the fact that Moshe has not found favor in Hashem's sight. The second duel negates the perception that leadership has been bestowed upon Moshe on the basis of some biological relationship with the nation, like that which exists between a mother and the fruit of her womb. Here the monologue adopts a metaphor that is nothing more than a continuation of the double negation. Obviously, Moshe did not conceive or give birth to the whole nation, but Hashem's bestowing the leadership upon him has made him into a nurse carrying a baby in her bosom. This metaphor gives rise to such a positive image in the mind of the listener that it seems almost to achieve the opposite of Moshe's intention. It's true that Moshe is not a nurse, but perhaps that is truly the appropriate way for the leader of a young nation to perceive his role, to gird himself with unending patience, and to understand that he has to take care of his nation like a mother taking care of her child. This positive tone in Moshe's words is strengthened in the concluding words of the first half, to carry them to the land that you promised to their forefathers. Is this not the life mission of Moshe himself, to carry Israel to their destined land? The second half of the speech opens with another rhetorical question, the third. Now we discover the reason for his previous questions in the first half. From the point of view of its position in the speech, this question corresponds to that which concludes the first half. These are two rhetorical questions whose answer is in the negative. The expression "this whole nation" is repeated at the start of each, and even their compositional structure is similar. Did I, ... that you have said to me, ... From where do I have, ... that they cry to me, ... Okay? But what is important in the parallel between the two questions is neither their linguistic nor their compositional similarity, but rather the harshly grotesque contrast between them. The image of a young infant at his mother's breast is an idyllic one full of gentleness. More even than the infant wishes to suckle, the mother wishes to nurse him. The infant himself is helpless, unable to voice his wish to his mother, while the mother's milk is within herself, ready to be given to him. If the relationship between Moshe and the nation was like this, the monologue would arouse no identification with Moshe's complaint. But at the beginning of the second half, the infant displays teeth, opens a demanding mouth, and shouts at its nurse with hysterical crying of its multitudes, "Give us meat that we may eat." The infant, hungry for its mother's milk in the first half, has undergone an artistic metamorphosis and has become an angry nation demanding of its leader, its nurse, not to drink mother's milk, but rather to eat meat. And so the nurse asks, "From where do I have meat?" Right? Let's just go back to look at it for a moment. Right? Did I conceive this whole nation? Did I give birth to it? That you have said to me, carry them in your bosom. From where do I have meat to give to this whole nation that is crying, "Give us meat that we may eat"? Okay, it certainly dramatizes it, but that's the analysis of this shift. The revolutionary change that has taken place in the nature of the infant and in the relationship between it and its nurse is a frightening mockery, and it explains retroactively Moshe's complaint. We may say that this reversal characterizes the difference between Moshe's leadership of Israel until now, which was in some ways as the nurse carries an infant, and the change that has now taken place with the complaint of the nation lusting after meat, a change that has driven Moshe to a crisis. Now we reach the conclusion of the monologue expressed as requests, in inverse order to the components of the dual question at the start of the speech, as we see in the table comparing them. An analysis of the speech has shown that it is only the event that preceded it, the crying of the nation lusting for meat, that could have given rise to it. Its content, artistic structure, and rhetorical weight all depend on that event. Moshe's complaint and the complaint of the Jews are two sides of a single coin, right? So that's not just sort of a happenstance that links these two stories, but it's what's behind this complaint that completely shifts Moshe's understanding and attitude towards who Bnei Yisrael is in this moment, that then really drives him to utter this complaint about leadership, which he didn't even have before. The gathering and the spirit. This is a story of leadership in crisis, but not in the sense in which it is usually understood in a Western democracy, where such a crisis is generally the result of personal failure on the part of the leader, or a loss of faith in him on the part of his nation, right? That's usually leadership in crisis. The crisis in our story arises from fundamentally opposite circumstances. It is the leader who has lost faith in the nation after the nation has revealed its heart's desires. In the face of such lowliness, the leader feels that he has not the strength to lead onward a nation that does not share his vision and wishes to go backwards to the good that was their lot in Egypt, to the fish that they ate there for nothing. It's something we've seen a little bit from Rav Sam, but also this kind of like broader context, 30,000 feet view, and situating this similar to what we saw in the Sota about sort of the ordeal, right? What is the overall genre that this is fitting into, and how is it similar or different from that genre in the world? So how is the Sota ordeal different from the genre of ordeals? How is this moment of leadership in crisis different from the general genre, of leadership crises? The solution that Hashem proposes is seemingly a technical one. 70 men of the elders of Israel will share with Moshe the burden of the nation, and for this purpose, Hashem will bestow some of Moshe's spirit upon them. But how will they help Moshe? The problem here is not a technical one, as we found in Sefer Shemot at the beginning of Parashat Yitro. There, what was required was the establishment of a hierarchical judicial system, which would save Moshe from having to deal with every legal problem that arose within the nation. This is the first time he's introducing this, but now that we're talking about the resolution to Moshe's leadership problem, we think about a similar leadership problem, which was the problem of Moshe burning out because he didn't have enough, person power to answer the nation's legal questions. That happened in the beginning of Parashat Yitro. That, says Rav Samet, that was a technical problem of person power and leadership, bandwidth. Okay? But here the question is how to extricate the nation from its lowly spiritual state. And how would these 70 elders help in this regard? Only in the formal sense can this be considered a response to Moshe. He says, I cannot alone bear this nation, for it is too heavy for me. And Hashem answers him by saying, they shall bear with you the burden of the nation, and you shall not bear it alone. It is difficult to understand how this is actually going to help. Right? How does having 70 more leaders get the lowly nation out of its state of having shifted from an infant to this angry beast lusting for meat? A hint at the solution to this question involves stylistic sensitivity to the guiding words that thread their way through our story. Here we come, I think, to the most powerful point that he brings. The key to the decline that appears in the nation lies in the multitude, the Asaf Suf, and a multitude that was in their midst lusted. This opens the story. It is this group that dragged the rest of the nation after it, and also Bnei Israel sat and cried. Right, so this group wound up leading to a kind of decline in the mood of the entire nation. What is hinted at in Hashem's response to Moshe is that corresponding to the Asaf Suf, the multitude that is lusting and drawing the nation after them, there must be an Aseifa, a gathering of 70 elders who will serve as an opposing force. These will be of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the nation and its officers, the best and most upright of the nation, representing a consolidation and strengthening of positive public leadership for the nation and a counterweight to the influence of the multitude. This is the reason why Hashem's response opens with the guiding word, Asafah li, gather to me 70 men. Added to these two words, which are built on the same root, Asaf Suf and Asefah, there is another guiding pair of opposites in our story. The combination is basar, flesh, and ruach, spirit, a pair often juxtaposed in the Torah. It is the spirit that gives life to the flesh, and without which it has no value. He quotes a couple of examples. Here, the basar refers not to flesh in the sense of the human flesh, the physical form dimension of humanity, but it refers to meat, meant for consumption. The word basar, meat, is repeated 3 times in the first half of the story, once in Unit A, with the Israelites' complaint, who will give us meat, and twice in Unit B in Moshe's complaint, from where do I have meat, that they cry to me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. Corresponding to the desire to eat meat, which originates in the multitude, the spirit must be strengthened as an opposing force by gathering the 70 elders. And I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take of the spirit, the ruach that is upon you, and I will put it upon them. Hashem is hinting to Moshe here that first the nation must be dealt with in a constructive way. The formal point of departure is indeed Moshe's personal complaint. But in Hashem's response, this becomes a platform for the elevation of the nation's spirit through the consolidation of a broad leadership of 70 elders who will acquire some of Moshe's spirit. Moshe feels that he cannot deal with a nation that is so distant from him and bridge the abyss that exists between them. Hashem's response is that he indeed needs a bridge between himself and the nation. These 70 elders are on one hand authentic representatives of the nation among the elders of the nation and its officers, but on the other hand, some of Moshe's spirit will rest upon them, and so they will be able to draw the nation after Moshe's spirit, instead of them being drawn after the multitude in their midst. In a sense, it's sort of like in the story of the scouts, you have the 10 who have the bad report, and you have 2 who have a good report, and a lot depends on the numbers. And if there had been more with a good report, the nation could have been drawn after them. So part of the idea here is we have this overwhelming Asaf Suf, this mixed multitude that has fallen to a place of lowly spirit. Moshe drags him down. He needs to make his own gathering of people with spirit to sort of, again, not just as a counterforce, not to attack, but just to lift up a different moment of spiritual response that hopefully can spill out to the people. Moses gathers 70 men of the elders of Israel around the Ohel as he was commanded. Now is the moment for divine action. That which was promised, and I shall take of the spirit that is upon you, and I shall place it upon them, is fulfilled abundantly, as expressed in the many repetitions of the word ruach, spirit, and in the facts described. The spirit of Moshe rested not only upon the 70 elders gathered around the Ohel, but even to 2 individuals in the camp, of whom we are told, and the spirit rested upon them, and they prophesied in the camp. Many commentators ask how this scene, the story of Eldad and Medad in Psukim 26 to 29, is related to the general narrative and what it comes to teach us. An answer is not difficult to find if we follow the reasoning of our analysis thus far. This scene puts Moshe to the test. The fact that the messenger runs to Moshe to tell him about the prophesying of Eldad and Medad in the camp, and Yoshua's response upon hearing the report, "My master Moshe, stop them," show how they perceived the event. Prophecy that was not under Moshe's auspices, unlike that of the 70 elders, was a challenge to his leadership. If Moshe had perceived Hashem's command that he gather 70 elders as merely technical assistance to his leadership, as nothing but a formal response to his complaint that he not bear the burden of the nation alone, and therefore he needs 70 more administrators, perhaps he too would have shared the perception of the messenger and of Yehoshua. These are two people who were not designated by God, so that's a problem to our administrative coterie that we built here. The prophesying of Eldad and Medad was not a form of assistance to Moshe's leadership, but rather presented a threat to it. But Moshe's response reveals a different understanding of the divine intention. Hashem meant to provide not technical assistance, but rather a strengthening of the spirit of the nation, a creation of a group of spiritual people who would prophesy and thereby influence the spirit of the nation against the influence of the multitude lusting for meat. Therefore, he, that's Moshe, answers Yoshua, "Are you zealous for me? If only all of Hashem's nation were prophets, that Hashem would give Hashem's spirit upon them," right? We need more of this. The word spirit is repeated 4 times in this unit. In its first three appearances, it refers to Moshe. But the 4th time in Pasuk 29, Moshe is speaking of Hashem's spirit being given to all of the nation. There is a complete release here from the perception that the resting of Moshe's spirit on the gathering of the elders is meant to ease Moshe's burden of bearing the nation, right? We've left that kind of concern aside. This unit concludes with the root asaf, the same way that it commenced. And Moshe was gathered to the camp by Yasef el HaMachaneh, he and the elders of Israel. What does this pasuk come to add? Right, and that's also an unusual kind of language. Let it just say Moshe went back to the camp, or just end the story. But it's very pointed, gathered to the camp. Often, by the way, Vayasef el Amo is the language of death, actually. So it's interesting to have this use of gathered unto his people here in a kind of a different sense. What does this pasuk come to add? The same message. It teaches us that the entire significance of the resting of the Spirit upon the elders is not so they will serve as an advisory and assistant body to Moshe. If this had been the case, they could have remained next to the Ohel. The whole point is that they return to the camp together with Moshe in order to influence, to educate, and to serve as a counterweight to the multitude in their midst. And a short epilogue. What is the lesson of our story? It seems that it is meant to teach us how a leader should behave in the face of a wild following without vision that rejects his values and desires meat. In response to Moshe's despair and helplessness, Hashem proposes an alternative that contains no innovation, but is nevertheless the best solution. An attempt must be made to make the spirit, ruach, prevail over the flesh, basar. And asefa, this gathering of spirited spiritual people, must be established to counteract the asaf suf, the mixed multitude. So I'm going to let that sink in for a moment and return in a moment. I'll be right back. Okay, so just try to take a moment summary here. We see these 2 different stories, which they can't be fully separated. It'd be hard to write these side by side in kind of a very, very simple, perfect kind of slicing in half. But still, these really do seem like 2 stories, again with some small link. And what otherwise kind of combines them as you read through, you really do see that they wind up to be in discrete units. So why are they intertwined in such a strong way? And he introduces to us a familiar concept, the guiding word, this Aleph Samech Fei, and does some close, literary and structural analysis of the sections. very much zeroing in on the centerpiece of Moshe's kind of monologue, and leads us to this understanding that it is this kind of transformation amongst the people, or the true colors of the people, this anti-climax to the buildup of good, which is, demonstrated by this sort of evil, wretched state that just transforms Moshe's understanding of his own leadership. And then therefore kind of both issues are intertwined and need to be dealt with. And they are, they come to be seen as kind of two sides of the same coin. Moshe has had this spiritual fall because of the state the people are in. They are consumed, so to speak, by basar, and Moshe, his spirit is low. And so the response, there is a technical punishment response that they need, but alongside that, there needs to be an attempt to reform and strengthen them. And that's what the gathering of the elders is meant to do, and to help Moshe use ruach and spirit to try to transform the people and shift them from this place of kind of mutual ra back to this place of tov, with the way we saw those keywords kind of being held opposite, and then the aleph samech fei interplaying throughout. Questions, comments, and thoughts?
I had once learned with David Silber that when Moshe is being so effusive with the word tov, when he's trying to convince his father-in-law to go with him. So he says, it's good and it'll be good and we're going to the good land. And he keeps using the word good, good, good. And you never hear an answer from Yitro.
Mm-hmm.
So David had said that Yitro saw what was coming down the pike. Yitro was a much more seasoned leader, but he realized that Moshe was not available to hear what he had to offer him. I don't think these people are really up to where you think they are. So
Mm-hmm.
therefore he kept his counsel to himself, and that's why there is no reply, because Moshe was on such a high at that point that to tell him this isn't going to play out the way you think would not have served any purpose. And then Moshe sees, and Moshe had to find that out for himself. He could not be told that. And then he, goes smack into that reality in the next parak. And that's the juxtaposition there. I thought that was such a good reading of it.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And I guess it cast Moshe maybe in, in blinded by his optimism in some way, and maybe a leader who wasn't, he was on that high, kind of coming more from the God side of things, and wasn't able to see exactly. And yeah, it's a poignant and painful kind of description of that moment, but really wonderful.
He hadn't been tempered yet,
Right.
by, he wasn't an experienced leader yet.
Yeah.
And he always was more a man of, Isha Elokim than, let's say, Aaron was.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Any other thoughts? I know the hour is very late. So thank you for learning along. And I found this to me to just be a wonderful glimpse of a Rav Samit kind of classic, the close reading and close breakdown, zooming in on the sections, a little bit of context and comparison intertextual to other parts of the Torah, the keywords, just really sort of, I think it's hard to read this chapter again without those things now kind of flashing at us, the Tov and the Ra, the Asaf, the Basar and the Ruach. So I think that's always a great contribution when you can read, for me, an essay that just heightens my attention to the various close literary dimensions of the chapter. So thanks to everybody, and we are off. Let me double check my calendar. We are off the next 2 weeks. I'll be home with my parents in Baltimore for the first part of next week, and then we'll be away with friends in Philly for the following. I will endeavor to send you essays so you have some good reading material in the absence of our learning, and we'll be back on July 8th. Thanks, everybody. I have the privilege of sitting next to my parents tonight, so I can wish them a local love you, and good night to all. Good night, good night.
Thank you.
Bet.